Hello again, HI 101. In this video, I'm going to go over Chapter 10, the Jacksonian Era, and this is sometimes called the Jacksonian Democracy, but in terms of the 21st century, you have to remember that this is for white males only. All the property restrictions had completely been stripped away, and any white male over 21 could pretty much vote at this point. But Native Americans, women, and people of color do not apply. Jackson was big on expanding economic opportunity for that said mentioned group and political participation, and he will use his presidential authority as first citizen or chief citizen to allow the government to stop being involved so much in the economy. He is a states' right guy. Jackson was always a man on the make. He was a Westerner, even though he's from Tennessee, which we don't consider West today. In the early 19th century, that is the West. And they're concerned with land accumulation and acquiring title to land anywhere they possibly can. And this is why Jackson, in his military career, had numerous run-ins with Native Americans, because they and others men on the make view natives as being in the way. They're in the way of land ownership, which Native Americans really didn't have that Western idea of private property. Whereas those men on the make was all about that. I want to be the baron of all I can see. I want to own all of this land. Whereas with many of the native tribes, that was something that was held by the group as a whole. And he'll use executive authority to stop the expansion. He also is one of the first politicians, even though he's not really a common man. He's sometimes called the first common man president. He's number 7, and he will reward his cronies. He'll eventually fire many Federalists who had been in those positions, many since the country started, and he will put his friends in those government positions as well. Another interesting fact from this time is that the political party conventions have their roots in the 1820s and early 1830s. The Anti-Masonic Party met in Buffalo, New York. That was the first political party convention, and then the Democrats followed suit shortly after that. Politics of scandal involved Miss Peggy Eaton. She married Senator John Eaton way too soon after the suicide of her naval officer husband. Why did he commit suicide? Was she involved with Eaton before? Who knows? Anyways, proper Washington ladies like John C. Calhoun's wife, Florida, snubbed her for her bad conventions and her bad morals. And this rubbed Jackson the wrong way. He was very fond of Peggy Eaton because she helped him out with White House functions, because Rachel, his wife, had died just after he won the election. And he saw many similarities in the way his wife Rachel was treated and in the way Peggy Eaton was treated, because they accused Jackson in 1824 of being an adulterer, and technically he was. He married Rachel before her divorce was finalized. You got to remember, in the 19th century, information does not travel quickly. And sometimes the status of pieces of paper are not clarified until weeks or maybe even months after the fact of their completion. Because of this, Jackson's kitchen cabinet, his close friends, come to have more an influence on him than the formal cabinet headed by John C. Calhoun as Secretary of State. He does not really have much to do with that wing of the Democratic Party anymore, and Martin Van Buren from New York State will actually become a more closer advisor to Jackson. He vetoed the Maysville Road bill. That was revenge for him, with Henry Clay, the Judas of the West, for throwing his support to John Quincy Adams in the 1824 election. Jackson vetoed this road construction bill because most of it would have taken place in Kentucky. And that sets a precedent until the 1930s of no real federal support for internal improvements. Funding is going to have to be done at the state or local level for internal improvements. The Second Bank of the United States was hated by the South and the West. It was a hard money operation. You had to have enough money in the vault in order to distribute currency, and there's always deflation of the currency in the 19th century. There's never enough money in circulation. And there's a bank war going on between the director of the bank, Nicholas Biddle from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Jackson will not allow the bank to be rechartered. So they tried to go around Jackson and do it before the actual end of the charter, and this did not work. In his second term, he's going to get rid of the bank and then distribute those bank funds, mostly tariff profits, and redistribute them to pet state banks. We'll get to that in a moment. The tariff of abominations really helped the Northeast textile mills, but it hurt the South. And that led to Calhoun's theory of nullification, the idea that states can veto federal laws that are viewed as unconstitutional because they view the beginning of the country as being a compact of states, not based on the people, but on the states ratifying that document so that it became law. And that is one of the articles in the Constitution, ratification, Article 8. And in the Webster-Haney debates in the Senate, it's basically states' rights versus national unity. Webster is a nationalist. Senator Haney from South Carolina is a states' right person. And in the South Carolina Nullification Ordinance, they nullified those tariff acts of 1828 and 1830. That forced Jackson then to push the Congress to pass the Force Bill, which would allow him to enforce federal laws and tariff collection with the U.S. Army if necessary. And Jackson threatened to go down to South Carolina and hang everyone from the highest tree that supported this nullification bill. There was a compromise pushed through by Senator Clay. There will be a gradual reduction in the tariff. But Jackson still signed the Force Bill, and he also signed the gradual reduction compromise tariff. So federal authority is upheld. South Carolina rescinded the Nullification Act, but also nullified the Force Bill, so it looks like states' rights are still in effect. So both sides claimed victory in this nullification crisis. Arguably, Jackson's lowest moment is the Indian Removal Act. It was forced relocation of Native Americans from east of the Mississippi to Indian lands on the other side of the Mississippi River, basically where the state of Oklahoma is today. There was resistance in the Black Hawk War in Illinois and Wisconsin territories. Illinois is a state at this point, but Wisconsin was still a territory. In the Florida region, there is the Seminole Wars. Osceola took refuge in the Everglades, and this was never really resolved officially until 1934. The Seminoles were never defeated. And this shows you some of the other tribes, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, and how they had to be forced to leave their native areas and going into Indian territory. Those are some of the last court cases of the Marshall Court. They sided with the Cherokee Nation in that 1831 case, and also with Worcester, and Jackson said, Mr. Marshall has spoken, now let him enforce these findings, and they were not enforced. The Trail of Tears was the Cherokee Nation's move across into Indian territory. They were ill-prepared for the cold weather that they faced, and thousands perished on the journey before ever reaching Indian territory. As mentioned, the Distribution Act, after the charter ran out and the Congress didn't renew it, the second bank ended. And those funds then are put in the state pet banks, and that resulted in widespread land speculation because land values skyrocketed for a time. Because of this over-speculation, Director Biddle issued the Specie Circular Act, which tried to temper down the sales of land, tried to temper the money supply to prevent inflation, but by responding with only hard currency as being acceptable, this helped to push the U.S. into the depression that becomes a full-blown one in the Van Buren administration after Jackson is out of office. Whigs versus King Andrew. Whigs were the former National Republicans. They're now called Whigs. And this is a renewal of the two-party system again. This is now the second formal political party era. They basically support the American system, and they are against Jackson, who is against any sort of federal government role in the economy. That's a function of the state and localities. That's not something for the federal government to determine. Van Buren, not Calhoun, will be Jackson's anointed Democratic Party successor, and he will win in 1836. As mentioned, there is the Depression of 1837, the Panic of 1837, caused by a bubble in land sales. And there is also a lack of hard currency available. Van Buren tried to solve it with the Independent Treasury Act. Federal funds were redeposited into the Treasury, but not into the bank, which doesn't exist anymore. William Henry Harrison and John Tyler then will run as Whigs against Van Buren. Because there's depression on, Van Buren loses. This is the so-called hard cider and log cabin campaign. W.H. Harrison was an Indian fighter. He fought in those Black Hawk Wars in the Great Lakes region. Tippecanoe and Tyler too was a slogan that they used. Again, this is white man's democracy in these years. And Harrison and Tyler win in 1840. He will be the shortest serving president. He will die of pneumonia after catching it in the presidential inaugural parade in March of 1841. There was a blizzard that happened. Harrison got sick and never really occupied the office. And Tyler begins the tradition at this point of the vice president becoming president. And this is the legacy of Jacksonian democracy. He is a strong nationalist. Make no mistake about that. Even though he is a Democrat, states' right person, he is also a patriot and does not believe in any sort of secession or nullification of laws. He wants to see white men be able to make it. But there is widespread economic and social inequality during these times. And that is it for Chapter 10.